morning. It is Wednesday, April 14th, and welcome back to The Advantage, where we walk you through the latest in political ads and spending. We have a little bit of a different show for you this morning. I'm Rachel.
I'm Ben.
And we have a guest with us. This is AJ Rehberg from G2 Analytics. Welcome, AJ.
Well, thank you, Rachel. Thanks for having me today. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, so would you just start off by telling us a little bit about G2 and what you guys do?
Yeah, so I started G2 Analytics 2015 with Alexander Gage and Calder Gage. Our primary focus is testing political video, advertisements, other types of video content that's used to reach voters, reach constituents, reach donors. But our primary focus is testing political video content.
Well, we've seen a little bit of what these guys do, and it's really awesome, so we're kind of excited to dive into the topic at hand today. Ben, you want to give us some background on what we're going to be discussing?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we were batting around ideas for what we wanted to talk about, the Georgia voting law kind of came to mind as one of the primary things that voters are talking about, that ads are being served on. So we decided that'd be a good test for kind of what we can all do together. So what we did was we looked at Georgia and we found that there were several groups running ads on voting in Georgia, but there's two groups primarily that were running ads focused around the Georgia Senate bill that's been somewhat controversial. Some saying it would restrict voting, others say it would protect election integrity. These two groups are Fair Fight Action and Heritage Action for America. So Fair Fight Action ran two different ads around this issue, totaling about a little over $1 million. And then Heritage Action for America ran one ad in Atlanta totaling a little over $500,000. So, AJ, what did we look at? What did we find?
Well, just taking a step back, what we found interesting about what Ad Impact does and where it kind of layers on what we do is, we can help understand how ads perform overall. But what's interesting about Ad Impact is that it gives us insights into the ad buys themselves. So where was the money put? How many points were put behind it? And that type of information, which kind of helps us better understand, were they making smart ad buys, were they making kind of inferior ad buys? And so what we looked at is how did these ads perform overall amongst a general representative sample of voters, and then identify where that money was spent to see if it was spent effectively or if the resources were used in an effective manner. And what we really found out was overall the performance of the Heritage Action spot performed best overall among the total population that we tested. But then what we also noticed was that of the two ads that were run by Fair Fight Action, that there was an ad that did not perform as well as the other, but a considerable amount of resources were put behind it, something like $700,000 in the first 15 days of March, which was really when that debate was happening. And so from an analytics standpoint, based on what we know about how much money was put behind it, where it was put and what DMAs, as well as the performance, we can start to understand how that messaging campaign was shaped. And I think that there were probably some opportunities missed early on by the Fair Fight Action by not having their strongest piece up from the get-go while that debate was happening. When they did transition, the debate was pretty much over. When they started airing the ad that performed better overall, not only with their target audiences, which were primarily minority voters, Democrat voters, those identified as liberal or moderates, but it also performed better with Republicans and conservative voters. So they transitioned a little late in the game from what we see. And so, looking at the totality of it, there may have just been some stumbles as far as the rollout of their messaging campaign.
And to set the stage a little bit, so Fair Fight Action went up first back on March 12th with their ad voting laws, which didn't perform particularly well when we tested it. Did not perform well with Republicans at all, but it didn't perform particularly well with the targeted groups either. Then Heritage Action comes in the next week with their ad election security reform that tested pretty well across the board, really well with their target audience, but also pretty well with the Democratic audiences as well. Certainly was not turning them off. Then by the time Fair Fight Action pivoted over to their ad Voting Is Our Right, that did score quite well, if not quite as well as the Heritage Action, the election was pretty much over. I mean, they had essentially passed the bill at that point.
The Senate had passed it. It had not been signed into law yet, but again, the debate part of it was over.
So one of the really interesting things that G2 does is when, correct me if I'm wrong, but when you show these ads to your representative sample, you get moment by moment reactions from the actual viewers.
Yeah,
right?
so what we do is it's kind of a hybrid approach. We use moment-to-moment video scoring within online surveys, which allows us to get much larger larger sample sizes. Not do it in a focus group where you might have 12 or 18, but also allows us to do it much quicker. So we can get that data back in a time where it can actually be actionable for campaigns. But so it's a hybrid. So we can also ask pre and post exposure questions. And also other survey questions that might be pertain to this specific topic. One thing that we noticed as well, not just in the individual performance of the advertisements, but how did people move pre to post exposure after being exposed to 3 messages in a competitive environment, in this case actually 2 that were in opposition to Georgia's voter reform laws and 1 that was in support. Given that even though there were 2 opposition messages, the movement was still from opposed to support, which is something that is another kind of barometer of who had the more effective messaging campaign and where did those people shift. And now a lot of the people that did shift to support were people that either felt that they didn't have enough information pre-exposure or said that they were not really aware of it pre-exposure, but after being exposed in a competitive environment to different messaging from the pro and the con, the movement was towards supporting the legislation.
So with that explanation, which is great, thank you, why don't we take a look at the Heritage Action Spot, given that that was the highest performing ad, and we're going to show it with the moment-to-moment overlay,
absolutely.
So that all of you can get an idea for how those specific messages were resonating throughout the 30-second ad.
Yeah, and the way that it'll be broken down in the overlay is with Republican voters, independent voters, and Democrat voters. Something to note that's a little bit different about our methodology for anyone that's used to moment is we're not a dial test. We're not trying to measure the intensity of respondents' emotions, but we're measuring the volume of respondents that react either positively or negatively at any given point. So that's just something to bear in mind, and yeah, we'll take a look at that Heritage Spot.
Absolutely.
We've got to strengthen Georgia's election laws.
The mess and the argument after this election was embarrassing.
It was bad for our state.
We need fair and transparent election laws so we can trust the final counts.
Thank your legislator for backing election security reform, requiring proof of identity for absentee voting, preventing interest groups from interfering in elections, equal rights for all voters.
One citizen, one vote.
It's time that we get this done.
Paid for by Heritage Action for America.
So that was really fascinating. It's really interesting to see the moment-to-moment scored against the ad, which I find super valuable. But I thought there's a couple things that were really interesting when we're looking at the moment-to-moment and kind of calling out certain things. We need fair and transparent election laws, and the mess after the election was embarrassing. Were 2 moments that scored really, really highly, not just for Republicans, but pretty positive for Democrats as well, which I found pretty interesting.
Yeah, and I think those are statements that voters typically agree with across the board. Not polarizing statements and not necessarily polarizing in the sense of this specific piece of legislation.
And then it's interesting because the point that had the most disparity between Democrats and Republicans respondents was requiring proof of identity for absentee voting saw the largest disparity between Republican and Democratic opinions. That was by far the lowest moment for Democrats and by far the highest for Republicans. So it seems really interesting that is really drilling down on what the primary disagreement between the parties seems to be around this specific bill.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the primary wedge issue of this bill. That's where a lot of the discussions occurred and a lot of the debates occurred around whether or not ID should be required for both in-person and absentee voting. And what we did see there is that, yeah, it was the highest level of polarization by Republicans and Democrats. But then what we also look at too is where do those independents trend within between the parties? Because sometimes you'll see them trending with the Republicans, sometimes you'll see them trending with Democrats. I think in this case, about net 10% of independent voters were in agreement with the statement of needing voter identification to vote in Georgia's elections.
Independents definitely had a positive response to that message, which is really interesting. And then at the end, they closed it out with some overall positive statements, equal rights for all voters, one citizen, one vote. They scored quite well across the board, probably unsurprisingly. Yeah,
and that's, again, those are statements that might not necessarily be controversial, but it does show that there is high level agreement among independents, among Republicans, even among Democrats, that that equal rights for all voters is something that's important and should be part of election integrity.
Yeah, absolutely. So should we take a look at the Fair Fight Action ads now?
Yeah, do you want to start with the one that performed better or the one that didn't perform as well?
Let's start with the one that didn't perform as well, because that was the first sequentially as well, so
Okay.
it gives us a nice little transition.
Perfect, yeah, we'll take a look at that and we'll be back.
Georgians of both parties have voted by mail for decades. Almost 500,000 Georgia Republicans did it just last year. The GOP knows voting by mail works. It was their idea. It's how Republicans won Florida. Now these same politicians who passed these laws want to make voting harder. That means longer lines, higher taxes, more identity theft for seniors, harder for you. Tell Georgia politicians, don't mess with our voting laws. Fair Fight Action is responsible for the content of this.
So this one's really interesting because it really didn't perform that well with any viewers, Democrats included.
Not what you'd like to see.
Yeah.
Certainly not to the level of which, especially something that had $700,000 put behind it in a key part of this campaign. You'd certainly like to see more support from Democrat respondents.
Yeah, when we break it down moment to moment, just nothing seems to really resonate. As you go through the first 4 or 5 points here, there's just nothing that really seems to have resonated with voters. Like, they get mild approval from Democrats, but it's hardly through the roof and just not really major claims. And then it spikes up at the end when it says, tell Georgia politicians don't mess with our voting laws, but that was kind of a main talking point. None of the specifics of the ad really seem to have resonated with watchers on either party, really.
No, and it also turned off Republican response. If you notice, Republicans started off with some agreement, but then once specific claims were being made, that support really dropped off, or that agreement. One thing that was really interesting to me is in the second half of the ad, where there are claims being made about things like identity theft, about longer lines, about making it harder for people to vote. You didn't see the types of spikes in agreement that you would expect to see from Democrat respondents, especially.
No, it's almost like when they went at the Republicans, that's how Republicans won in Florida. They managed to turn off Republican viewers without spurring their own base at all. I mean, that turned off Republicans, clearly you can see in the moment to moment, but didn't have a corresponding spike amongst their own target demographic, which is really just not what you want. I mean, you're turning off the opposition without spurring your own base.
Well, I think it's really interesting too, watching where Republicans really drop off when talking about making voting harder. That clearly was not a popular statement. That Republican messaging has been doing a good job framing this as election security. We're not trying to make it harder for you, we're just trying to make it more equal and safer for all people who are involved. And I know that's not really reflected in the data, that's kind of my speculation, but I would say that message is working with Republican voters because they're hearing this is harder and completely disagreeing with that whole statement.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. Absolutely.
That's really interesting because then their second ad performs much, much better. Not quite as well as Heritage's ad, but much, much better. So shall we watch that?
Yeah, let's take a look.
Good. Cool.
As Americans, voting is our right. So why are Georgia lawmakers trying to take that away with new bills that put my identity at risk and limit my access to voting the way that works for me? That's just not right. Georgians deserve the freedom to vote their way, safely, without worrying. Tell your lawmakers, don't mess with our voting access.
So this ad performed a little bit better across the board. The most notable thing here is that the first statement out of the gate was, as Americans, voting is our right, and we were just chatting that we are happy to see that is still a very popular statement.
Across the board.
Democrats, Republicans, and independents, we can all still agree on that. And then we get into some other claims that perform a little differently depending on political party affiliation.
Yeah, so this one is interesting because they say voting is our right, which scores really well across the board. Everyone agrees pretty much across the board. Then they say new bills that put my identity at risk, which just kind of isn't really something we've seen around this bill that much. It doesn't perform that. It performs really poorly with Republicans and independents and doesn't do that great with Democrats. The citing in the ad is Senator Walker's testimony from February. So a little bit of a weak citation there, and voters seem to have picked up on that. But then it picks up really well at the end for Democrats, and they kind of finish really strong with this ad, with some generic statements that I'm not surprised score well. Georgians deserve the freedom to vote their way safely without worrying, and don't mess with our voting access. All do really, really well with Democrats, and you see a huge spike in independent support as well.
Yeah, and if you go back to the risk of identity theft, this is a claim that was made in both spots. And again, we didn't see that spike in agreement among their key audiences, being Democrat voters. And so where that claim came from, why it was you brought up in two different spots, and didn't perform well compared to other messaging. It just makes you wonder if that real estate in that 30-second spot could have been better used with some messaging that had higher levels of agreement among key target audiences. And to your second point on the latter part of the ad, where the statement Georgians deserve the freedom to vote their way, I think that's something that we're seeing in other public opinion research that's publicly available, as well as some of the survey questions that we asked that were not directly related to the advertisements themselves, but about attitudes and opinions towards voting security and election security in Georgia, is that we are seeing a lot larger support for absentee voting, for the ability to have that available to anyone who wants to request it. And so that's something that I think across the board, maybe public opinion is shifting on that. Then there are questions of how do you do that in a secure manner, assuring that one citizen, one vote, which is something that goes back to the heritage ad, but it's something that I think yes, voting should be easier, and I think this is something that we discussed a little bit earlier. It should be easier, but it should also be done in a secure manner, which is really the debate that this bill has kind of sparked in at least national political discourse, if not just Georgia political discourse.
And it seems interesting to me that Heritage kind of nailed that from the get-go. They ran one ad and they really hit the right notes that we found in this data right from the get-go. Fair Fight Action got there, but it really took them halfway through their second ad, at which point the bill had already been passed by the Senate.
And they had spent a lot of money.
And they had spent a lot of money. You wonder if they had ran that first ad first and maybe used more of the freedom and kind of focusing on the themes of what is American and what, liberty and freedom, whether it might have scored a little better. Is that enough to change things? Who knows? But it might have been a little bit of a better use of resources.
Well, and they'd also, spent over $700,000 to purchase over 2,500 gross points.
Yeah.
And something else that I think is interesting from your information is we also know what DMAs these are running, and some is a little bit different from the Fair Fight Action versus Heritage, is that Fair Fight Action was up in 6 DMAs.
Yeah.
Obviously, they were heavy in the Atlanta DMA, but we're also purchasing points almost at an equal level of points in Augusta and Savannah, in Macon, in Columbus, and in Albany. Whereas Heritage really focused just on that Atlanta DMA and put all their points and all their resources behind that spot there.
Absolutely. Well, that's great analysis. It's really interesting to break these ads moment by moment, because it's one thing to look at them as a whole, but when you break it down moment to moment, it really allows you to get down and you can see exactly what are the specific claims. Like, you can see an ad did well, but what specific claims? And I think this really allowed us to pull it apart and see what kind of messages resonated with voters and what did not.
Well, I think that's something that kind of is similar between what Ad Impact does and what G2 Analytics do. Every time we see political ads, we're interested in, is it moving the needle? How is it moving the needle? And I think the more that we can start to marry the insights that we can gain with the insights that you guys are gaining, that we can really start to have a more holistic understanding of what's working, when it's working, when things can be adjusted to optimize ad spends, ad buys, creative development, all those types of things that make campaigns more effective and use their resources in a better manner.
Yeah, we saw $9 billion spent last cycle, but you got to optimize those resources, because if you're spending all these money on ads that just don't work, you're essentially flushing money down the drain.
I would have loved to have seen this for some of Michael Bloomberg's.
Yeah, just ask Bloomberg. Yeah,
they killed him off, I heard.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly the case here, and something that we started G2 Analytics to do was, because of digital content now, there's a lot of video that's being produced that doesn't get that same treatment that you would for a spot that you're going to put $700,000 behind or $1 million behind, but it's still going to be out there. It's going to be used in a targeted way. So we wanted to come up with a methodology that didn't require doing in-person focus groups, didn't require 2-week time frames to get it set up, to get it done, to get the analysis back. We wanted it to be really something that was agile and fast, and and allow campaigns and organizations to test more content more often so they can really make better ad buy decisions. Again, what you guys are doing is great, because I think once we can look at the effectiveness in terms of how it was actually deployed or where it was, where the ad buys went, then we can really start to understand the impact of ads. Because again, you might have a really good ad, spend a lot of money as a campaign. If it's my opposition, I may not be that worried about it. But if it's a really good ad that is being, has money behind it and is playing in either DMAs or against target audiences that are persuadable, then maybe it's something that I might need to dedicate some resources to. So again, I just think having both pieces of information is extremely valuable in the context of campaigns moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we found some incredible data here, and the turnaround time is 3 days. So
Yeah.
it was really a really interesting experience, and love to have this data. So if anybody has any questions about this data, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can see AJ and I's emails below, and please reach out if you have any questions.
Yeah, so big thanks to AJ
Yeah,
and
thank
G2
you.
Analytics for being with us. This was a lot of fun. And stay tuned for more insights. You can also follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. If you have questions, like Ben said, reach out, and have a great week.